Well, welcome Power Query fans. I hope we are all Power Query fans, aren't we? Yes, good, good, good. It's a funny thing to be a Power Query fan because, of course, Power Query isn't really a product on its own. You know, you use Power Query as part of something else, as part of Power BI Desktop or Fabric or Excel. So that kind of makes a presentation like this a little bit strange to do. So if you want to know what's new in the world of Power Query, we're going to have to do a kind of whirlwind tour of all of the places that Power Query lives. We're going to have a look at Power Query in Power BI Desktop. We're going to have a look at Power Query in Excel. We're going to have a look at Power Query in Dataflows Gen 2. And then just to make sure you stay till the end and don't get distracted, I have permission to give you a sneak preview of something which is coming very soon, which I think is the coolest thing to happen in the world of Power Query for a really long time. You can read it off the slide, but we'll get to it at the end. Anyway, so it's going to be a lot of demos in a lot of different places, some of which may go wrong. We'll move swiftly on if they do. But if you think, this isn't relevant for me, don't worry. There'll be a new demo along in 5 minutes that may well be relevant. And even if it's not relevant, hopefully there are some things which are cool and fun and engaging. So where shall we start? Let's start in Power BI Desktop. Pretty much everybody here, I'm sure, uses Power BI Desktop, and Power Query is, of course, the get data experience in Power BI Desktop. What's happening in Power BI Desktop is that we are getting a new, refreshed Power Query experience. You might be aware that if you've used Power Query in Power BI Desktop and compared it to the Power Query experience in, for example, Dataflows, they look the same, but they're not quite the same. There are actually two versions of Power Query. There's the kind of old school Power Query in Desktop and Excel, and then there's Power Query Online. What's happening is that the version of Power Query Online, is coming to Power BI Desktop and eventually Excel. And that's going to give you a whole bunch of great new features. So let's see that. I've got Power BI Desktop here, but I've got a special secret preview feature switch turned on, which gives me the new Power Query experience in Power BI Desktop. Before I do that, I would like to say that for all of my demos, I'm going to be using some very boring data in Excel with some sales information and some producers. So bear that in mind for all of my demos. It's all going to come from an Excel file. All right. So here we are in Power BI Desktop, and I'm going to get data from that Excel file. So I'm going to use the Excel workbook, and you can see it's already going to start to be a little bit different. You know, I can browse. Let's make sure we've got this on my clipboard. And let's browse to this. We're going to get the demo data file. Click Open. Click Next. I can get the producers and sales table. Click Load. And, shouldn't have clicked Load, but I should have clicked, let that load. It's going to be very quick. It's nice and small. This is why you do small things. Click Transform Data, and here is the brand new Power Query experience in Power BI Desktop, which is currently in preview. It's in private preview. You won't be able to get hold of it yet because there are some things that don't work. But what's the point of this? Well, from a developer's point of view, having two separate code bases is a bit of a pain. And you might also be aware that there are some cool things in Power Query Online for Dataflows that just haven't made their way to Desktop. With this, you will get all of those cool things in Power BI Desktop, which means you get, for example, diagram view. There we go. We can see now that you've got those diagrams that you like from Power Query Online. If we go to maybe let's merge and merge queries as new. Let's get sales and producers. You know, subtle quality of life experiences like these nice, colorful join kind boxes that you get in Power Query Online, which, you know, I think are real usability improvements. Click OK, and there's our diagram. Okay, the whole experience is a little bit snappier. It's a little bit faster, which I like. And we go up to here to view. You've also got schema view instead of data view. What's the point of this? Well, if you're working with large amounts of data, you might sometimes get a little bit frustrated with how slowly Power Query shows those updates. Well, with schema view, it's not showing the little data preview, which means that everything is going to be that much faster. And you've also got, in script view, you can go and not only turn that off, but you can see the entire query in this bar here, instead of having to go to the advanced editor. So that's pretty nice. We've got consistency between Power Query in Power BI Desktop and Power Query in the web. So yeah, that's quite fun. Oh, some other things that I forgot to mention. You've also got up here, if we go to this, we've got the step folding indicators that you might have seen online, which allow you to see more easily where the query folding is taking place. And if we do this, we've got the query plan, which has only been available in line. That looks quite scary, but trust me, it's quite useful when you're troubleshooting performance. Like I said, this will be coming to public preview later this year. You might not really notice it, but it will give you a whole bunch of new experiences that have been present in Dataflows for a long while. And it means that you're just going to get that consistency between what happens in the desktop and what happens in the service, which is nice. Now, like I said, this is a very bitty presentation. That's all I'm going to say about Power Query and Power BI Desktop. Moving on, we've got some more interesting stuff happening in Excel. Power Query was originally an Excel feature. And there are a couple of things that you get in Power Query and Excel that you don't get anywhere else. One of those things is the concept of data types, which is quite a big thing now in the world of Excel. Now, this isn't an Excel presentation, but a few things I'm going to show in a moment kind of turn on this concept of a data type. Power Query has had support for data types in Excel for probably about 2 or 3 years. There have been some new innovations such as nested data types, which only turned up last year with Power Query. So let's see how those things work. All right, let's close down that, and let's open up a new instance of Excel. And let's see what we mean by data types. So here's Excel. And guess what? I'm going to go to Get Data from File, from Excel Workbook. And we will point to that same boring old Excel file that we had before. And in a moment it will wake up, I hope. There we go. And I'm just going to click and select the producers table. Let's go to transform data. So we've got a table here with some products and producers and countries. So nothing very interesting. If I select all of these columns and go to transform, there's a button here in Excel that you won't see in any other Power Query, and that is the Create Data Type button. What does this do? Well, I've selected all of these columns. I'm going to click Create Data Type, and I'm going to create a data type called Products. You can see that there is a display column here. I'm going to create something which contains all of this product information. The thing I want to display initially is the name of the product. I've got an advanced tab that allows me to select individual columns, but I selected those anyway. Click OK, and I'm going to go Home, Close and Load to, and I'm going to load this into a table on my existing worksheet. Now, normally in Power Query, you output to a worksheet and you get the table of data. Now here, you'll get a table of data, but with something special in it. Click OK, and what do we see here? Well, we can see the names of our products, but we've got this interesting logo here. This means that we've got an Excel data type. This is something that's happening a lot in the world of Excel. This is where you can store multiple values inside a cell. Now, if I take apples and hover over this data type button here and press enter, this is where you can see a card that shows a preview of all of the data from all of those columns that was there when I collapsed it into a data type. And I've also got a card up here on the top of my table, which means that I can very easily extract individual values from that data type. So if I go here and say, show me the category, I can expand out and go and get the country. So I can expand these values out in a table, but data types like this can also be accessed using Excel formulas. So if I start to write an Excel formula and say A2, which is a cell that contains apples, you can see that the formula knows that there are these extra values there that I can reference. So if I say A2.category, you know that, you probably knew that lemons and limes are citrus fruit. Do you know that apples and pears are a thing called a pome or a pom? I don't know, you've learned something already. There we go, so we can extract these values from that Excel data type in the cell. We've also got a field value function, and I can say A2, and I can get the value from A2 and get exactly the same thing there. So I've got a field value function that now allows me to extract values from there. Now this is something that's been around in Power Query probably for about 2-3 years. Not many people use it, but I thought I'd mention it because there is one new thing that's happened in the last year also with Excel data types, and that is the concept of nested data types. Right, let's get rid of these columns. And we will, come on, delete. All right, let's edit this query. And instead of creating a data type with absolutely everything in it, you can see some of these columns are producers. So what I can do now in Power Query is I can select just the producer columns, go to transform and create a data type. We will call this producers, and you can see that I've got a producer data type, and then I can select product, category, and producers and create a data type here and call this products and click OK. So I've created a data type and I've used that as a column inside a data type. I've got a nested data type. And now when I click close and load and this refreshes, well, I've still got apples, pears, and oranges, but now you can see that I've got producers collapsed up like this. And if I hover over the card for apples, you can see that producers is itself a data type, and I can go and click and drill down into that nested data type. And I can say here A2.producers and hit enter as before. And I can see that I've got the producer Chris back. And then I can say producers.producer country, which is United Kingdom. So Excel data types is still a work in progress, but you can see now that with Power Query, we've got this concept of outputting data types and nested data types, which I think is quite interesting. It's something that the Excel team are pursuing quite a lot, and it's nice to see Power Query supporting that. It's also relevant where we come on to perhaps the new, most exciting innovation in Excel. Did you know that you can write Python in Excel? All right. So everybody in the Excel world is very, very excited about Python. But what's Python without data? Well, Python in Excel can access data on the worksheet, but we don't want to work with just data in the worksheet. We want to get data from all different places without having to land it on the worksheet. And Python and Excel can access Power Query queries. But interestingly, and this is the kind of thing I get excited about, Python and Excel can access Power Query queries without you having to load the Power Query query onto the worksheet. I promise you it's going to get more exciting, but I get excited about all this kind of stuff. All right, so let's go to recent sources, and let's get our sales table. Click OK. All right, so there's my sales table. I'm going to click Close and Load. The really important thing here is that this is connection only. I have not loaded this table to the worksheet. There is nothing up my sleeves. I'm going to go and create a new worksheet here, and I'm going to start to write a formula in this cell. Now, I can do this by using the py function. As soon as I do that, you can see something magic happens inside the cell. And actually, if I go to the Formulas tab, you see there are some Insert Python buttons here. But what I'm going to do is I'm just to start writing some Python. And you can see, as soon as I use the Excel function here, I can not only get access to tables on the worksheet, but I can get access to my Power Query queries, including the ones like sales that have not been loaded to the worksheet. So if I say Excel sales and do Control Enter, what do we get back? Well, we get something that looked very similar to what we had before, but now we've got a data type which is a data frame sitting inside a cell. So by default, you'll see this. It's a data frame. And as with before, look, I can click on the card, and I can see a preview of the contents of the data frame. I've also got this up here, and I can get hold of things like a preview of the array, the name of the type. Let's have a look at the type. You can see it's a pandas data frame. I can also, clicking on this, you'll see up here there is this little drop-down box here. I don't want to show this as an object inside a cell. I want to go and change it to an Excel value, and there's the output of my Power Query query. I'm not a Python person, but I am going to show you one more other thing, and I don't want to turn this into a Python presentation because Power Query is way more exciting than Python in my opinion. But let's write a little bit of code and do a Python visualization on the output of that Power Query query. Control Enter. And what do we have in this cell? Let's make it a bit bigger. Oh, look, there we are. We have a bar plot created using Seaborn inside a cell, returned by a Python script that uses a Power Query query as its source. That, I think, is pretty exciting. It's nice to see Power Query playing nicely with the latest innovations in Excel. There are some limitations with this at the moment. It doesn't work with Power Query queries that get data from the current Excel worksheet, which I think is a bit of a pain. You can't also create Power Query queries that return functions and call those functions and pass values into them. I would love it if that happened as well, but I can't make any promises here. I'm not from the Excel team, even though I'm friends with the people who do this. But, there's some interesting stuff happening. What else can we talk about? Power Query in Excel Online. Let's talk about Power Query in Excel Online, because Power Query in Excel has always been a desktop thing, right? Well, guess what? Power Query is already there in Excel Online. It's been there and been in production for quite a long time. You could see the queries but not really do anything. You can today actually refresh Power Query queries that don't connect to any other source or connect to sources that don't need authentication. Coming pretty soon, later this year, you will be able to connect to authenticated sources or sources that require some form of authentication, like Azure SQL DB. And then eventually you will get the full Power Query Online experience in Excel Online. Let's see this very, very quickly. Well, what have I got here? I have got another Excel spreadsheet. Let's close this because we don't need it anymore. And I've got a Power Query query here, which is very simple. Whenever I refresh the query, it gives me the current date and time, which means that I know, because when the value changes, the query is refreshed successfully. Okay, so we'll close and load, and here in Power BI desktop, Excel on the desktop, if I refresh this, there you go. You can see I've got the current time. Cool. Let's close that. And let's go up to here and open this in the browser. I can go up to the data pane and show queries and connections. Notice that the time here in the browser, the last time I refreshed was 10:41 and 11 seconds. I can refresh this here. There we go, 10:41 and 44 seconds. So you can refresh your Power Query queries in the browser, and soon it will support all kinds of authenticated data sources, and hopefully at some point you'll be able to do things like use Office scripts to refresh your Power Query queries, which then means you could use Power Automate to schedule refreshes of Power Query queries in Excel without having to do anything on the desktop, which, again, I think is pretty exciting. A lot of people are very interested in being able to do that. One other thing, I'm not a Mac person, but Power Query for the Mac is a thing. It's getting more and more sources. And there is also one other kind of hidden feature in Power Query in Excel. Let's close this and let's reopen current date time. If I open up, let's reopen that, go on. If we open up this query and go to File, even if you use Power Query in Excel all the time, you might not notice that this has appeared. You can go to File and Export Template. So you've now got the ability to export an Excel Power Query all of your Power Query queries to a .pqt template file, which contains all of the M for all of your queries. Now, weirdly, in Excel, you can't import a template file, but there's another place you can import a template file. Because next, we're going to be moving on to Fabric and Dataflows. This is where things get more and more exciting. So, within Fabric, we've got Dataflows, but we've got Dataflows Gen 2, a kind of new improved version of Dataflows. I assume everybody's used Dataflows in Power BI here. Okay. So when you start using Dataflows Gen 2 in Fabric, you kind of think, this is the same. What's different? There are a number of subtle changes and improvements. So let's go to Dataflows Gen 2 and see what we've got. That's what's different. So I'm going to open up a folder on a Fabric workspace, and I'm going to open up an empty Gen 2 data flow. Let's close that Copilot pane because we're not going to go there just yet. You can see that we've got an export template button up here to export to a template, but I've also got the ability to import from a Power Query template here. So let's do that. Let's choose that current time PQT file I created, click open. There we are, bingo. There's a Power Query query imported from a template file. All right, that's pretty cool. What other things have we got that's different here? Well, let's see what the get data experience does. A few things that have changed here. This is a new, improved experience to help you find your data more quickly. You've got the One Lake Data Hub that allows you to browse all of your Fabric data sources here. You've got something which I know is going to error in this case, but you've got a very, very new option here for Azure. It's been traditionally quite difficult to connect to resources in Azure in Power Query Online. This button, it would work in my real tenant, but there isn't actually an Azure account associated with the tenant I'm using here. We'll make it very easy for you to kind of look at your ADLS Gen 2 storage and all of the other Azure resources and connect to it from here. So that's pretty cool, but we're not going to do that because we want to, guess what, connect to an Excel file. And there's something new here as well. So I could connect to an Excel file, say, on-prem, but if I want to do just some quick and dirty analysis, sometimes it's a little bit of a hassle to kind of connect to a file on premises because, you know, you've got to know the path, you've got to create a connection. It's all a bit difficult. We've now got this new upload file option here, which means that I can click to drag and upload. Let's create demo data. It just uploads the file, stores it some temporary storage somewhere in the background. Click next. And here we are again with our producers and sales. Now, I don't recommend doing this for anything in production, but if you wanted to play around with some data that you didn't want to change the original source of, well, you know, you can upload it very, very easily here and get going. And let's click create. And there's the good old Power Query Online experience. We cannot do a demo about what's new in any Microsoft product without talking about Copilot. And guess what? There is Copilot for Power Query. It's in preview, which means it can be a little bit temperamental. It was playing up a little bit this morning. Hopefully it's going to behave itself now. But generally speaking, I would say Copilot for Power Query here is my favorite Copilot in Fabric. You know, I'd have seen in the keynote people talking about, you know, Copilot for building reports. You type something and it kind of just works. Copilot, I think, works better when it's generating code. What sits behind Power Query? It's M code. And guess what? We've got Copilot here that can generate some M code for us. So let's click on the Copilot button here. Incidentally, to use this, yes, you are going to have Fabric turned on. Yes, you're going to have an F64. There are reasons for this. You know, it costs some money. But, you know, I think this is a really, really great productivity enhancement for anybody who is a kind of self-service user who wants to learn how to use Power Query. So there are three things that we can do, three core things that we can do with Copilot in Power Query in Dataflows Gen 2. The first thing we can do is we can create new steps. So let's look at our producers table again. And let's grab a prompt here and say, let's filter the table so I only have products that were produced in the country France. Now, the mistake I was making this morning is that I naturally wanted to click the publish button. I'm reminding myself not to do that because that will be a disaster. I'm going to click this little paper airplane button here. And let's cross your fingers. Everybody cross your fingers. It does take a little bit of time to think about it. And here we go. Look, I added the following step to your query, and we've only got the products in France. And if you know some M, that is indeed the M code to filter this table by France. That's pretty cool. So we can add new steps to an existing query. It's quite sophisticated. I've chosen something really basic here, but it can actually do some really quite complex transformations that even me as a very experienced Power Query user, it would take me quite a long time to think about doing. We can also get it to create a brand new query. This is where I was having some problems this morning. But in this case, I'm going to say create a new query that gets data from producers and returns everything from the category citrus. That will also remind me to, I should have done the previous thing, which was undo that step. We've got an undo button, and it will return the query to its previous state. Let's post the new query in here to get the new query for citrus. There we go, and the diagram view shows that really nicely. It's created a query that references the producers table, and it has filtered it nicely down to citrus. And then last of all, we can get it to explain what it's done. So if you've ever had to pick up somebody else's data flow and it's got like 5,000 steps and you're thinking, what on earth is this query doing? I can now say, tell me what this query does. Hit send, and it will give you a nice description of all of the steps in the query. There we go. Select the producers table, and then filter the rows where the category column is equal to citrus. I think that's pretty cool, and I think genuinely useful. You know, a lot of people complain and moan about Copilot and say, oh, I'm not going to use that in the real world. I think this has got some genuine uses for self-service users. Because you can do a lot of things in Power Query, but you've got to know where the buttons are. This does a lot of the hard work for you. There's more with Dataflows Gen 2. So, Dataflows Gen 1 was two things. It was a self-service data transformation tool, and it was some storage, because when you ran your data flow, did all your transformations, it outputted the result of those transformations into some storage that it controlled. And then, using Power BI Desktop or Excel, you can connect to that and get your data in. The key difference, I think, between Dataflows Gen 2 and Gen 1 is that Dataflows Gen 2 is just the transformations. It doesn't have that storage anymore. How's this an improvement? I've taken away something. Well, you've taken away the built-in storage, but you've now got the ability to load your data to different destinations. So let's choose this query here and have a look. You've got the following built-in destinations in Dataflows Gen 2. You can load to Azure SQL DB, you can load to Azure Data Explorer, and since you're working in Fabric, you can load to a Fabric Lakehouse and a Fabric Warehouse. Let's choose a Lakehouse. I'm going to click Connect because there's some other things here as well. Let's connect to the current Lakehouse. God, I need to clean up some of these workspaces. I'm going to choose my Lakehouse. You can see that I've got the option to connect to a new table or an existing table, and it's called Query at the moment. I'm not going to go through and finish this wizard. But if we click Next, we've got some new options to control what happens when we load the data in. In the past, people were saying, well, okay, Dataflows just load the data into their storage. But, what about the existing data? We had the concept of incremental refresh in Dataflows, which incidentally isn't there yet in Dataflows Gen 2. But, when people started asking me about incremental refresh, it became pretty clear that what people wanted was something a lot simpler than incremental refresh. They just wanted to be able to take the data that they were getting from their data source and add it to the data that was already there, instead of doing anything really sophisticated. You've now got that option. Now, this is hidden behind some automatic settings here, but if I turn those automatic settings off, you can see a couple of things. First of all, you've got this option to say, let's just leave the data that's already in the destination and append the new data returned by the data flow to it. You've also got the ability to replace the data in the destination, as you did before, but even then, there's some new features, because if you're replacing the data in the destination, it's going to wipe the data that was there and create it all again. And you've got these new options, fixed schema and dynamic schema. With fixed schema, it will keep the table in the destination you're loading to, and it will just delete all the rows and reload the data. But what happens if your schema has changed? What happens if you've added or removed a column? This is what this dynamic schema does, because dynamic schema drops the table in the destination before it reloads, which means that if your rows, if you've added or replaced or changed existing columns, well, it will recreate the table in the destination, which means that those new columns, or the columns that have been deleted, will then be reflected in the destination as well. Which again, I think is pretty nice and pretty useful. Let's click cancel. Now, something we've all done is we've clicked this publish button and then had a really tedious time waiting for Dataflow validation. Well, if we click on the drop up here, you can see we've actually got two options here, publish now or publish later. Publishing takes your changes and actually saves them properly so that you can use them when you refresh. But if I just want to close, I can go to click, show me. All right, it's playing up. I should be able to close that. All right, publish later would have done the same thing there, but it didn't want to show it up after doing that. Let's reopen it. And I promise, if I was to go, all right, that's a bug. It's just needs to get its authentication back. If I click publish later, it's going to close, and none of those nasty spinnies waiting. But if I do want to go back up here, and I click publish, it's now going to load. It's going to do all of that validation in a moment. So there's the validation spinny. And it's also going to start refreshing automatically. I didn't want to refresh. I wanted it to just validate without refreshing. So the other good news is, and actually let's just set this to refresh up here. Here's another data flow. If I've got something that's refreshing, no, hold on. I didn't want to see the refresh history. Refresh history is also something else that's worth seeing. But if I was to refresh this data flow, it's going away and refreshing. Well, when that's spinny, there's the refresh there. Guess what? I've now got a cancel refresh option. I can cancel the refresh of a data flow. I can do that through an API. I can do that through the UI here. One last thing to talk about. Oh, let's cancel that refresh. All right, so let's reopen this. One last thing. In Power BI Dataflows Gen 1, we had something called the Enhanced Compute Engine, which allowed you to kind of load data into some mysterious hidden database behind the scenes, and then all of your upstream transformations would be able to take advantage of the compute in there, and query folding would happen on that. We've got the same concept here in Dataflows Gen 2. Instead of the fact that it uses some mysterious enhanced compute engine, guess what? In Fabric, we've got a fully featured, highly scalable warehouse engine, which means that by default, if I've got this enable staging option turned on, these queries, producers and sales, will load their data into a temporary warehouse sitting in the background. And this query here, which remember filters the data coming from producers, that has a little Harry Potter flash on it, which means that now that filter is going to fold against the warehouse engine, where it's loaded the data in the background. This is really cool. Staging is turned on by default and enforced in some scenarios. I would say, if you're playing around with Dataflows Gen 2, turn off staging unless you're working with really large volumes of data, say a couple of million rows, because there is actually an overhead in loading the data into this staging warehouse. So, we're going to be working on that and changing some things in the future, and we're going to have some better smart defaults. But bear in mind, if you're playing with Dataflows Gen 2 today and things seem a little bit slow, ignore that. All right, come to the last demo. This is the really, really cool stuff. Oh. Paginated reports. Paginated reports. Who knows SQL Server reporting services? Who are the old people in the room? Yeah, lots of middle-aged white men like me who remember paginated reports. Yeah, exactly. And yes. Paginated reports. They've been kind of seen a bit like the kind of neglected, boring, older sibling of Power BI reports for a long time. But they're there. They're there inside Fabric. What's new in paginated reports? Well, you can use Power Query, or you will soon be able to use Power Query to connect to data inside paginated reports. Now, I've again had special permission to show you this. It's going to be released into public preview soon. So I've got an early build of Power BI Report Builder. And here we are. Let's create a blank report and choose sales. Now, in a paginated report, I used to have some very limited choices of data. But guess what? Now I've got a Get Data button to get my data. And if I choose this, this will take a little bit of time to open up for the first time. We get the full range of Power Query sources available for paginated reports. Why is this useful? Number one, it gives you access to a whole bunch of sources that you never had before in paginated reports. Working at Microsoft, I'm always hearing from people who use Snowflake or BigQuery or something, and they say, well, I want to be able to use Snowflake as a source for paginated reports. But today, I've got to go through a gateway, I've got to go through the ODBC connection. It's really horrible. But now, look, I've got all of these sources that I can now use with paginated reports. Now, out of all of these sources, what's the most exciting source that I'm going to use for a paginated report that I couldn't do before? Excel, of course. Excel. So, well, before we do that, let's go back to good old demo data. And instead of that demo data, what we're going to do is we are going to open up demo data in OneDrive. So there is my file in OneDrive for Business. Okay. We're going to go to here, and I'm going to use the Web Services connector for a variety of reasons. And let me grab the URL for that. Now, the interesting thing here for the Power Query geeks is that I've already set up in the Power BI service a shareable cloud connection to that Excel file. So instead of having to set up any authentication here, it's able to reuse that connection that I've defined in the cloud, which I think is pretty useful. It's pretty nice. So there's the connection to my Excel file. I'm going to click Next. And there we are, producers and sales. We're only going to get sales this time. Click and transform data. And there we go. There's our good old sales table. Now, for now, I'm just going to click Create. And I'm going to insert a table. Drag that onto there. There's my data set, product, country, sales. Now, I care about data visualization, so let's try and make this a little bit prettier by making the header black. And that's about it as far as making reports look pretty go. But click run, and we will load. And there, now, it gets better. It gets better because let's go back to my Excel file. And let's say pineapples from Singapore, and they'll have a sales of 250. So I've gone back to Excel. I've added a new row to my table. I need to close this to make sure it actually saves properly. But guess what? Let's refresh. And there we are. It's taken those changes. I've entered something into Excel. And just to prove that it's rerunning that query every time, we've got that. Now, one last thing I hear you ask. I know paginated reports. I know SSRS. Can I pass parameters to it? Yes, you can. It's not immediately obvious, but it kind of works in a logical way. So let's edit the Power Query query. It's going to complain about a lack of credentials in a second, because like I said, this is a temporary bug. Come on, come on, come on. It would happen just as we're kind of like running out of time, but this will be a very, very fast demo, I promise. It's all gone so well so far. Okay, now I knew this error was going to happen, so just click connect again, it'll all work again. I'm going to go to manage parameters and create a new parameter. I'm going to call this R threshold. I'm going to make it a decimal number, and let's make this 100. Click OK. So I've got a Power Query parameter that returns 100. I'm going to go to sales, number filters, greater than or equal to, and this parameter, which is threshold. And now I've only got the sales which are greater than 100. So let's click create. That's good. I go to my paginated report parameters and say, let's call this P threshold and call this sales greater than or equal to. Make sure this is a integer parameter, click OK. And then last of all, go to dataset properties, go to parameters. We'll add a parameter. We're going to say P threshold is R threshold. I did call it R threshold, I think. And hopefully we click run. And let's say 150. So there's sales greater than 150. Click view report. And there we go. We've passed the parameter through to a Power Query query, and it's gone back and queried an Excel report. So that ends our kind of whirlwind tour of what's happening in the world of Power Query. Some of it, I hope, was interesting and relevant. Please leave your feedback on the screen. And while we're finishing up, I can take some questions.
There's one question from the online.
Mm-hmm.
About presentation materials.
Yeah, presentation material. So the question is, am I going to have presentation materials? The slide deck will be available, at least. Not the demo materials, because a lot of the stuff won't work yet. So, questions in the room? Do we want to get the microphone up?
So the new experience coming to Power BI Desktop, can you narrow that down to a quarter at least?
No, I'm not going to make any promises about this. It'll come when it's ready.
Thank
This is
you.
my job. You don't get me this way. My job is to tell people we don't make promises about timelines.
How reliable are those query folding indicators? Because in the past, they've been a little hit or miss.
So yes, I mean, the question is how reliable are query folding indicators? They can be, they need some interpretation sometime, that's sure. But I think if you know what they're trying to tell you, they are reasonable, and they're pretty good about saying, well, we're not sure whether things are going to fold or not. It's actually pretty hard sometimes to know when query folding is going to happen until the query actually runs. There are situations where a data source says query folding is going to happen, but actually at runtime, it turns out that the data source is broken, we get errors back, and we fall back to a kind of non-folding query plan. I've got a blog post talking about alternates in query plans, Power Query query plans for that. So, I'll cut them some slack. It's actually a really hard problem to solve and much harder than you might think. Maybe one more question?
Yeah. I was wondering, when you use that upload file option in Power Query Online, does that file get available in OneLake storage?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I couldn't hear for the clapping.
The upload file option in Power Query Online, does that file get stored in OneLake so that we can access it with other?
No, it doesn't. So the question is, where does that file get stored and upload? I had that same question. You can actually see from looking at the M code, it seems to store it somewhere in OneDrive, which is interesting because that account there that I was using for demos does not have any Office license or Azure subscription associated with it. But I would imagine there's some secret storage somewhere that every user gets that it's able to put it in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Power Query in paginated reports, very, very exciting. So I know you can't say exactly, but we're talking short, medium, long term?
Very, very short term.
Ah, perfect. Thank you.
All right, maybe two more questions.
Last two questions.
Yes.
For Dataflows Gen 2, do you have to have Fabric?
Yeah, so the question is, do I have to have Fabric for Dataflows Gen 2? Yes, you do need to turn the Fabric switch on in your Power BI tenant to be able to use Dataflows Gen 2. Okay. Yes, you do.
Hello. During the demo for Dataflows Gen 2, you showed a new feature where you can temporarily load that table. And I do recall a blog post you reference a while back. There is a M code where you can load the table into memory to do complex transformations later.
Yeah.
Is that feature you mentioned kind of like a replacement for that?
No, it is something completely different, actually. So I think you were talking about table.buffer,
Yes.
which buffers data into memory inside the Power Query engine. What I was showing with Dataflows Gen 2 was actually loading the data into a Fabric warehouse that gets spun up in the background inside your workspace, and then any downstream queries which reference the output of that query get to use the data that's stored in the Fabric warehouse as a source, which means that if query folding happens, it's going to be a lot faster because it's all folded back to that.
So it's
Fabric
an enhanced
warehouse.
version of buffer function.
Well, no, because if you were buffering data in memory, there wouldn't be any performance improvement because it would still be the Power Query engine.
Okay.
Cool. Anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much, and play with Power Query.